Well, thank you so much. I'm certainly delighted to be here once again. The folk here, Holly and everybody, staff, they're always good to me. And I always am excited about being here. We're going to talk about seldom told African-American stories of World War II. Now, in order to do that, we have to set the background. If we don't, the significance of some of the individuals that we're going to talk about, it may seem as if, oh, it's no big deal or anybody could have done it. But, when you consider the entire history of African Americans in U.S. military history, we will discover that what they did was absolutely incredible. And this is going to be like an inverted triangle, inverted pyramid. We're going to start wide and we're going to narrow it down. But the first half is absolutely necessary in understanding the challenges that many individuals had to go through. Now, since that first shot fired from Lexington Green, Massachusetts in 1775, Blacks have defended this country. As a matter of fact, the first Black person to lay his life down for the soon-to-be nation was CRISPUS Attucks. Now, 2 weeks later, George Washington took over the Continental Army, right? And he made it very clear at the very beginning that he did not want the very old, he did not want the very young, and he did not want Blacks to fight. Blacks were seen to be cowardly, all sorts of stereotypes, which would eventually be obliterated over and over again. And, and they would be a danger to their masters. And so that was the policy, did not want Blacks fighting. It was not until Lord Dunmore decided, he actually put out a decree, says, hey, any enslaved, any Black person who is willing to fight for the crown, we will guarantee you your freedom. Now, if you're enslaved and you're about, somebody guarantees you freedom, do you really care whose hand it comes by? And then eventually the colonists, soon to be United States, started to employ Blacks fighting. And so, there's a concern. Are they going to fight for the right people? Are they going to fight for the country? And here's what Alexander Hamilton said. He said that if you want to secure the Blacks' fidelity, give him a musket and his freedom, and you won't have to worry about that. And of course, 8 years later, America won its independence. I have to say that some of those individuals who were promised freedom did not get it. When the War of 1812 rolled around, once again, this is 31 years later, Blacks are there fighting once again. And there is still a fear of arming Blacks for obvious reasons. It's like they may turn those guns against the wrong individuals. And even, listen, long before the Second Amendment, there were ordinances on the books that forbade Blacks from bearing arms. And so, and I've seen them as early as the 1640s. And so, listen, defending the country and full citizenship go hand in hand. And if an individual is willing to lay his life down for the nation, you cannot deny them full citizenship. So even then, there was a hesitancy to arm Blacks to defend the country. As I said, Blacks participated in every war that the United States has had. During the Mexican-American War, a lot of them served as laborers, scouts, and support personnel. And then, of course, we come to the American Civil War. Now, Frederick Douglass was very instrumental in recruiting troops for both the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. Amongst the first 23 individuals he recruited, two of them were his sons, Lewis and Charles Douglass. And here's what he said. He says, once let the Black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his buttons and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. So once again, we see that theme again, that if you're willing to defend the country, you should be entitled to full citizenship. And as I said, Mr. Douglass was recruiting for both the 54th and 55th Massachusetts, and he was going into Pennsylvania and got a little bit upset with Mr. Lincoln because he did not think that Mr. Lincoln was taking this thing seriously. This is the beginning of the war, and he almost stopped recruiting, but they worked out their differences, and of course, the rest is history. Now, Blacks fought in major battles: Port Hudson, Fort Wagner, July 18th, 1863. So, you know, we're right around that time of that commemoration as well. And amongst the first individuals to capture Richmond were individuals of the 25th Army Corps. Now, with the exception of its officers, the 25th Army Corps was Black. And so we moved to Reconstruction. This is after the war. And we know that there are were three amendments during that period: 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th was for the abolition of slavery to the degree that it did abolish it. 14th was for citizenship. 15th was for voters' rights. I have to tell you that there was pushback against all of them. And of course, Reconstruction ends in 1877, a backroom deal. But here's my point when it comes to Reconstruction. As a result of Blacks' performance in the Civil War, after the Civil War, they authorized Blacks to fight. It was on a segregated basis, but they were authorized to fight. It started out with about 6 units, and then eventually it became the 24th, 25th Infantry Regiments and the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the last we know as Buffalo Soldiers. So 1898 is significant. It's the Spanish-American War. It's the first time that America fights together after the Civil War. And some of the most experienced individuals in the Spanish-American War were those Buffalo Soldiers, those guys who were regulars. And, you know, the entire time they're out west fighting against Native Americans. You know, everybody is familiar with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And I heard a lecture series by a general, and he said that, you know, the Rough Riders got real lucky. They got real lucky. Well, let me just tell you what happened. There were Black troops that actually came to their rescue. One of the participants of that battle was quoted by the Washington Post. And here's what he says: "If it had not been for the Negro cavalry, the Rough Riders would have been exterminated. I am not a Negro lover, but my father fought with Mosby's Rangers and I was born in the South. But the Negro saved that fight." And even Theodore Roosevelt attested to that. So now we come to World War I. And once again, Blacks are called to defend the country. W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois says, "Let us, while the war lasts, forget our special grievances and close ranks shoulder to shoulder with our white fellow citizens, fighting for democracy. We make no ordinary sacrifice, but we make it gladly and willingly." Now, remember, this is after Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, and the end of Reconstruction. And for a lot of individuals, it's getting bad again. And what Dr. Du Bois said, yeah, I know we're fighting for civil rights, but you know what? There's a bigger issue on the table, and let's prove that we do love this country and that we will just defend this country. And he is saying, hey, let's go over and fight. Now, a lot of individuals like, look, let's just use, you know, Black folks for stevedores, you know, carrying box from here to there, right? There were 2 large infantry divisions during World War I, the 92nd and the 93rd. Both of those infantry divisions were in the latter battles in 1918. So when the culmination in Meuse-Argonne, a lot of those guys are there. As a matter of fact, on July 15th, somewhere around, we're not sure exactly when he was born, but around July 15th was the birthday of William Henry Johnson. Now, William Henry Johnson was African-American. He fought with the 369th of the 93rd Infantry Division, and he ended up fighting off a German patrol. These guys, I'm still trying to figure out how many it was, but it was quite a few, and he fought them off with a bolo knife. I mean, this is hand-to-hand combat. He's dealing with these guys, and France gave him the Croix de Guerre in 1918. But he also won the Purple Heart. Matter of fact, he sustained like 21 wounds during that engagement with those German soldiers. And so he won the Purple Heart, he won the Distinguished Service Cross, and he also won the Medal of Honor. But he won the Purple Heart in 1996, Distinguished Service Cross 2002, and the Medal of Honor 2015. That is 67, 73, and 86 years, respectively, after his death. Why he could not have been honored while he was alive. And he died destitute, I think it was in 1929. I also must mention that during the summer of 1919, there were a series of anti-Black race riots that went on around the country. The statistics say that 76 African Americans were lynched, 14 were burned at the stake, 10 of the victims were soldiers, and some of them were still in uniform when that happened. That would not be the last time that soldiers in uniform would be killed. And so here we go. We're narrowing this thing down. In 1925, there is a report by the U.S. Army on the use of Negro manpower in wartime. And this report, most of the World War II veterans that I talked to, I would have to say all of them actually, were not aware of this report, but this is the lens through which the Army is going to see them in the next war, in World War II. And it essentially said that Blacks were lazy, shiftless, dishonest, afraid of the dark, smaller brains, superstitious, immoral, not patriotic, and inferior to white men in every way. And that's the conclusion. So it didn't say you couldn't use Blacks in the military. It's just saying, hey, you probably need to, get them to move this box from point A to point B, but don't expect any higher cognitive processes on behalf of Black folks. And so that is the lens through which the military is looking at these individuals. Now, we're going to talk about some of these units and some of these groups and what they did, and I'm going to introduce you to some individuals that I have had the pleasure to know. But I did want to mention that there was a movie entitled The Negro Soldier. What the military did, they hired about 5 Hollywood producers for the purpose of putting films together for propaganda films. There was one movie in particular geared towards the Black population. It was entitled The Negro Soldier. And it starts out, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he's a preacher, and he starts out in church. The congregation is there. He acknowledges some of his congregants who were in uniform. And one of them was a woman, and he called her private something. And she says, "Oh, no, Reverend, private first class," right? And she says, "Yeah." He says, "Of course you are," right? And so he's talking, and he says, "I was going to preach on one thing, but now but I think I'm going to preach on something else." And he ends up talking about African Americans in U.S. military history. And he starts from the very beginning, and his intent is to start from the beginning, the Revolutionary War, and come up to World War II, and pretty much encourage his congregation and everybody who's watching the film, really, why it's important to support the country during World War II. And when he comes to the Civil War, over 750,000 military, deaths and 50,000 civilian deaths, the most cataclysmic war in all of the 19th century. It lasts for about 16 seconds. And it essentially says, and then the war came, and then you see 2 sides fighting. It's slightly out of focus, so you don't know which side is which. You hear Battle Hymn of the Republic, and then you hear excerpts of Mr. Lincoln's second inaugural. And then he goes on, right past it. I'm thinking, wait a minute, over 209,000 Blacks participated in the Army and the Navy during the Civil War, and you didn't mention that. You're talking about Blacks in U.S. military history, and you didn't mention this. And I wondered why that was. I eventually found out a long time after. There's a book called Five Came Back. The thing was, the War Department said, don't mention anything about the Confederacy, Lincoln, Blacks defending the country for the Union. Don't do it because, listen, everybody knows at the end of the Civil War, there were 2 things on the table: race and reunion. You wanted them both to work out, but in the long run, the only thing that was really emphasized was reunion. And so mentioning the fact that Blacks helped to save the Union during the American Civil War would not work well as far as reunion was concerned. And so that movie, you can check that movie out on YouTube. And so over 1 million Blacks served in World War II, and many of those stories are not told. A lot of people had no idea of Black participation in World War II or to what degree they did. If you look at the footage, you don't see them much, right? Dory Miller was a messman on the USS West Virginia. And when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he manned a machine gun and shot down 2, possibly 4 Japanese aircraft. And he had never had gunnery training. And after that, they required every sailor to get gunnery training. At some point, he was awarded the Navy Cross and was awarded by Admiral Chester Nimitz. Dory Miller was killed in 1943. He should have been on a war bonds drive, but he was killed when his carrier Lipscomb Bay was sunk. And it was sometime around the Battle of Tarawa. Also in the Navy, there was the USS Mason. USS Mason served in the Atlantic. I believe it was the Atlantic. And with the exception of the commanders on the ship, the entire crew was Black. And so, you know, that's a seldom told story. Of course, there are the Montford Point Marines who are getting a lot more airtime these days. But back then, I mean, those guys were part of, many of those guys ended up fighting in the Pacific during World War II. We did mention the 92nd and the 93rd Infantry Divisions who fought in World War I. Well, they're fighting in World War II as well. The 92nd Infantry Division was in the Mediterranean, particularly around Italy. And the 93rd was in the Pacific. It was one of the Army divisions in the Pacific. The Triple Nickels were airborne infantry, and those guys were part of the 82nd. Now, they did not go overseas, but what they did do, the Japanese around that time were starting to understand the jet stream, and they were sending incendiary bombs that they would launch, would come over the United States and drop, and they started forest fires, and some of those guys were called on to put those fires out. 761st Tank Battalion fought over in Europe. There is a book about them that's out, but there were other Black tankers who fought in World War II as well. Someone else who's getting a lot of recognition these days is the 688 Central Postal Directory Battalion, led by Charity Adams. Charity Adams was the highest ranking Black woman in World War II. And what those ladies did when they got overseas, the mail facility was in disarray, and those ladies had 3 shifts, and they were working around the clock to get the mail sorted and to get it delivered. Their motto was, no mail, no morale. And so that's what those ladies did, and they are finally being recognized. There were also Tuskegee Army nurses who were down in Tuskegee. I think there were like 21 of those ladies, and I happen to know the daughter of one of them, and she's got a website. If you just Google Tuskegee Army nurses, she pretty much did a biography. Miss Pia Jordan did a biography on all of those ladies, and I think she may have one or probably one, maybe 2 that she's still trying to put together. But if you're looking for Tuskegee Army nurses who are part of the Tuskegee experience, that's a good place to start. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, these were African Americans. Let me tell you, it was years before I realized that there were Blacks who were in the initial waves of D-Day. I didn't know that. As a matter of fact, there were just under 2,000 African Americans who partook or took part of the Normandy invasion. I didn't know that. I didn't see any footage. I think some of that footage was actually lost. It was shot, but lost coming back. But I didn't know that was happening. This 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, these guys were on the initial waves of D-Day, and their job was to raise barrage balloons. They look like these small versions of the Goodyear blimp, and they're on cables, and these cables have charges that were attached to them, and the purpose was to prevent German fighters, the Luftwaffe, from being able to strafe the beaches. What you don't want to happen while you're trying to get a foothold on the beach for airplanes to come down and shoot up your guys and your equipment. And so these barrage balloons, they couldn't fly, because if they flew down there and their wing hit the cable, it would detonate one of those charges and blow their wing off. And pilots, that would mess up your day as a pilot. There are some people who I want to introduce you to in just a moment, but I wanted to just talk about some of these groups. And the Red Ball Express was one of them. These guys were truck drivers. Most of them were African American. They were, once the front left Normandy and started to advance, listen, they had to get their equipment. I don't care how bad you want to fight. If you don't have food, if you don't have your arms, it's not going to work. And so these guys were driving on roads 24 hours a day. And part of the issue was because of the pre-bombings of Normandy, the infrastructure just was not there. So these guys had to drive. And then, of course, we know about the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American aviators who were afforded the opportunity, or should I say, who earned the right to fly combat. When that whole process started, they just did not want Blacks to fly. And people like, oh my goodness, they're not smart enough to do that. But here's the thing, pursuit flying, fighter combat, most difficult type of aviation, and they put them in there, and they excelled. 992 of those guys received their wings, and they ended up, I would say maybe some of them were single engine, right? So they were fighter pilots, but there were also some who went on to become bomber pilots. Now, we talk about the pilots. Everybody talks about the 992 pilots, but there were about 15, 16,000 non-aviators who were part of that as well. And those are your armorers, your mechanics, your ground control, your air traffic controllers, doctors, supply individuals, all of those guys. If you were a part of particular units that were considered a part of the Tuskegee experience, then you are considered a Tuskegee Airman, and those individuals were and are entitled to the Congressional Gold Medal. Now, everybody's aware of the 332nd Fighter Group. 332nd consisted of the 99th, 100, 301st, 302nd Fighter Squadrons. The 99th was the first. Benjamin O. Davis was a part of that. He ended up commanding the 332nd, and they just sat home for a very long time. And finally, they were sent overseas. And when they first went over, they were flying in North Africa, and they were attached to other fighter groups. But of course, you know, listen, our military was segregated. The 100, 301st, 302nd Fighter Squadrons comprised a 332nd Fighter Group. And when they went overseas to Italy, the 99th joined them. So you had 4 fighter squadrons in the 332nd Fighter Group. Now, there's another group of Tuskegee Airmen that you know, a seldom told story, the 477th Bombardment Group. These individuals were training to fly B-25 Mitchells. These were medium bombers, 2 engines, and they were going to fly in the Pacific. While they were training, the war ended and they didn't go overseas. But here's their claim to fame. Now, this had started with the 332nd. Colonel Jefferson, who I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, said that he was flying. They were up at Selfridge Field, and radio came across the radio, get on the deck as soon as possible, report to the auditorium, and they did that. And they were told, hey, you can't go into the Officers Club. And that was January of 1945. But these guys are 477. Some of their officers were trying to go into the Officers Club. This is April of 1945. And they were told they couldn't get in there. And a bunch of those guys got arrested. And there were actually 2 different groups of arrests. The first ones went in and, man, they were going to court-martial all of these guys. And Colonel Selway said, yeah, you guys are officers, but you're trainees, so you know we'll give you a separate facility. According to regulations, they were officers and they could go into the Officers Club, and so they pressed the issue. I think the black press found out about it, and when this thing finally ran its course, I think one individual was fined for striking another individual or something like that. But that's their claim to fame, and those guys, you know, you can truly say that their protest was a nonviolent protest. And when these individuals came home, you know, they came home to still having to ride the back of the bus, still having second-class accommodations. I mean, you know, had to go around the back to be served at certain restaurants. One of my former co-workers was in Korea, and he talks about Gil Lyons. My goodness, I love Gil Lyons. He talked about coming home from Korea, and they went to a restaurant after he got 2 Purple Hearts, and they would not serve him and the people he was with. And he noticed because people who came in after them were being served and were leaving. And but that type of thing, that's some of what those individuals still had to come home to. So, you know, segregation in accommodations, we talked about German POWs. And of course, you had veterans killed too. World War II veteran George Dorsey was killed after returning home July 1946. And we must also mention the fact that this GI Bill, which was entitled, or which every veteran was entitled to, was not fairly done. Most individuals, you know, if you were Black, if you were a woman, you might not have been able to go to the school of your choice, depending on what the policy of those universities were. And so a lot of people couldn't go to certain schools. And then also, especially when the GI Bill, as it pertained to you purchasing a home, you couldn't just, depending on if you were Black, you couldn't just purchase a home anywhere you wanted to. Certain places were redlined, and so you couldn't live in certain places. So even though they got the GI Bill, it was still, the practices were still discriminatory. And so I have talked about some of the units, I've talked about some of their experiences, but let me just tell you, I have had the pleasure to meet so many individuals, and sitting down and listening to them has been life changing for me. And one of the individuals I had an opportunity to meet, and that was Dr. Roscoe Brown. And he was a captain. I think he rose to the rank of captain, but he would always go by the name of doctor. He would go by the title of doctor. He's one of the first individuals credited with shooting down ME-262, a German jet. But he talks about after the war, he was trying to find a job as a pilot for the airlines. And he went in, he took his application in to one of the airlines, and he says, okay, thank you. And he left out, and he realized that he had left his newspaper in there. So he went back in because he wanted to read it. And as he went back in and opened the door, he saw the receptionist putting his application in the trash. And she was like, look, we're not going to be able to hire you. And but if you listen to Dr. Brown, he says, look, that's when he determined that he was going to go to school and get his PhD. And that's exactly what he did. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson, I had the pleasure to meet him, and he just passed a couple of weeks ago. I think, you know, you'd have to know Colonel Jefferson. He ain't sugarcoat anything. He didn't pull any punches. And he was a POW for like 9 months, got shot down. He was flying on a mission. He says a round came right up through the floor and out the canopy. He says he immediately bailed out. He says his plane had caught fire, probably hit the main fuel tank or somewhere. And he bailed out. And he said they were trained normally to wait 4 seconds before they pulled the ripcord, but he knew he was close to the ground. He was strafing. And he said as soon as he got out, he pulled his ripcord, and he said within 5 seconds he was on the ground. You know, so pulling it earlier actually saved his life. But he talked about coming home. He says that when he came home, he could see the Statue of Liberty in the distance, and they felt good about being back home. He says, but when he came down the gangplank, there was a white corporal with a sign that said white this way, colored this way. And Colonel Jefferson says the same old I'm not going to say it, but if you know Colonel Jefferson, you know what he said. And that's what he came home to. And Colonel Jefferson went on to teach school in Detroit. And it's interesting. This is what I find with most of these veterans. They don't tell you what they did. They don't tell you, you know, they were part of something greater than themselves. And most of his students had no idea that he was a Tuskegee Airman. There's also another individual I came in contact with. I took a picture with him when I was at Reading. And when I first saw him, and I cannot remember his name, he gave me some pictures of him. They're sort of like postcards. And there's pictures of him. He's got stripes on his sleeve, right? He was enlisted. And one of the guys in my reenactment group came to me and says, look, man, you need to meet this person, right? And I go over to the person, and he's starting to choke up. And I don't know what it was. He started telling me his story. He said he was out in the Pacific. He was walking around a B-17. It might have been in a hangar. And he was just fascinated. He's walking around. And there was this chief petty officer who said, hey, you know, you want me to tell you about it? So the petty officer is telling him about it. He says, you want to get in the plane? He says, yeah. He took him inside the plane. And it turns out this petty officer was African-American. And I'm thinking to myself, man, something good's about to happen to this chief petty officer, right? I mean, this petty officer. And so he's sitting down, he lets him sit in the left seat, and they're actuating the flaps and everything. And the person in the picture that's been shown said that he really wished he could have been a pilot. And guy says, yeah, really? Oh, okay, it's cool. You know, so he left, and the guy was somewhere. And this petty officer came up to him in the middle of nowhere and just said, it's been taken care of. And he turns around and leaves. And he didn't know what that was all about. And then about a day or so, he got orders to report to flight training. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, you know, I thought this was going to be something that good happened. This was an African-American doing something for somebody else, right? And that person ended up flying, and he ended up having his own B-17 over in Europe. And he finished his career as a lieutenant colonel. And I thought about it, this one encounter with an African-American warrant officer. And he said he was trying to find the guy and was never able to find it. And I've tried to find him and haven't been able to find him, or at least find his family. But it changed the trajectory of this man's life and the life of his family. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart, another Tuskegee Airman, lives in Dearborn, Michigan. Dropped out of high school, I think, after 10th grade. It wasn't that he wasn't a good student. He just wasn't interested in school and thought that he could make more money. Then, of course, the war came around, and he had an opportunity to apply for flight training because he knew that, you know, if he went into the Army, he got drafted, he's going to either be digging ditches or washing dishes. And so the same day that he was supposed to report for enlistment, his orders came to report to Tuskegee. And he ended up going, and there was some, I think it was a corporal. And he says, well, I've got papers for flight training. He says, I don't care. You're going into the Navy. And a second lieutenant came out. He says, let me see his document. Looked at it. He says, oh, this guy's in a different category. I can only imagine how many individuals ended up in the Army or the Navy when they should have been somewhere else, right? Colonel Stewart, April 1st, 1945, was Easter Sunday. He was flying on a mission, and he ended up getting credit for 3 aerial victories. He shot 2 German aircraft down. The third one was actually about to get him, but he maneuvered me, and the third one cartwheeled into the ground. So he got credited for all 3 of those, and he ended up winning the Distinguished Service Medal. This guy who had to go back to high school at 20-something years old ended his career as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force and also vice president of some oil consortium. Of course, one of my best stories is Miss Amelia R. Jones. I met her. She came up on a flight Savannah, and she was not supposed to be on that flight because she had pneumonia, was just cleared the day before. And we reported out. I saw her out where the buses normally load and unload. And I just went to her and said, ma'am, I just want to thank you. I've walked through a lot of doors of opportunity because you and so many others kicked them off the hinges. She said, son, you're welcome. Now, she was a sergeant. She rose to the rank of sergeant. And I saw her again 20 minutes later. And I could have gone my separate way. And I said, ma'am, this time I have to hug you. And I knelt down next to her and I hugged her. And there was a photograph that was taken just before what I'm about to tell you. And she asked me, can you take me to the women's bar? I said, yes, ma'am. And so I did that. And she starts telling me where she served. She's like, oh, I served, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not a math learner. So these numbers are going in one ear and out the other until she says, in the last 2 years, I was in the 99th under B.O. Davis. And I'm like, wait a minute, 99th Pursuit Squadron? She's like, yeah. I'm like, Benjamin O. Davis Jr.? She's like, yeah. I'm like, wait, D99? Yes, DBO? Yeah. I said, ma'am, do you have any paperwork to prove this? She says, my discharge papers. I said, ma'am, do you know that you are a Tuskegee Airman? And she looked up and she says, I don't think so. I said, no, ma'am, you are. And it's not just, listen, it ain't just the pilots, it's everybody in part of the Tuskegee experience. And before she left, she said, I want my red jacket. Well, it got around the memorial that there was a Tuskegee Airman there, and she was female. There were some soon-to-be chief petty officers who were there, and they were just about ready to. Savannah was about to go home, and 3 of those 4 chief petty officers, women, said, "Hey, we heard the Tuskegee Airman. Can we go meet her?" We said, "Go right ahead." So they went on it, and I thought it was only fitting because these ladies were actually standing on the shoulders of Miss Amelia. And a few weeks later, went down to Savannah, Georgia, and Miss Amelia got her red jacket. She was inducted into the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, but the story did not end there. A few more weeks later, went back to Savannah, and she was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for her participation as a Tuskegee Airman. And 1 year, 2 weeks after I met her, she was cleared for her final flight. But for 1 year and 2 weeks, she knew that she was part of the Tuskegee experience. As I said earlier, just under 2,000 African Americans were at D-Day on D-Day. One man in particular was Mr. William Simon. He was the father of one of my high school classmates. And when I found out he had been at Normandy, I called him one day. I said, Mr. Simon, can I interview you one day? He says, yeah, son, sure. I said, okay, because I'm only 10 minutes away. So he pauses like, yeah, okay, come on over. And we sat down on this front porch and we must have talked for 45 minutes. He's starting to tell me this story that he's going to training and then they get leave for like 3 weeks or something. And he says he knew something big was going to happen. And they ended up going over to Normandy. I think it was quartermaster. He was working with the quartermasters. He was. And so, they're getting stuff on the beaches, and they were scheduled to go in at Omaha. And the coxswain said, it's a little rough. We might want to go in at Utah. So they ended up going in at Utah. And he got in at 10 o'clock. I said, hey, Mr. Simon, listen, were they still shooting at 10 o'clock? He's like, oh, yeah, they were still shooting. And so he was a part of that. And had he gone in Omaha, we might have been having that conversation. But he went on into the school system. He became a teacher. And at one point, he was a part of the union. I think he might have been president of the union, DC Teachers Union. And they went on strike, I believe it was in the 70s. And it was against the law for them to do that. And when they went to court, the judge, they told the judge, we know it was illegal. We will accept the fine, but we're asking that the money go towards a scholarship. And so it became a scholarship for teachers over the years. And 2016, they named it the William Simon Scholarship Fund. But that's what he did. And actually, I was in Pearl Harbor when he passed. That was December 7th, 2016. Sometimes just being in the right place at the right time, and you get these stories. This was 2014. I was at the World War II Memorial. It was June, I think it was June 7th, but we were commemorating some D-Day veterans. And so these guys are coming, I'm greeting all of them. There's one who's in a wheelchair, African-American, I shake his hand, you know, and I'm greeting him. Listen, I love all of these World War II veterans. And especially those who look like me or who I look like, you know, because I'm like, man, wow, you know what, I was there, you know, so it is what it is, right? And the program was over, and he was coming out of the memorial, and I said, so sir, where did you serve? And he sort of ashamedly said, and I was a truck driver. I said, wait a minute, you part of the Red Ball Express? You part of the Red Ball Express? And his face lit up. His guardian, he had a young white guardian, and his face lit up because he knew the story too. And I'm pointing to people I don't know. I'm like, this guy right here was a part of the Red Ball Express. And man, tears came down Mr. Johnson's eyes, man. And I took a bunch of pictures with him. And so they went to get on the bus, and I walked over where the kiosk is. And man, I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden, you know, it's like these kids, these middle schoolers are dancing to swing dance. I said, listen, kids, you see this guy over there? He was a part of the Red Ball Express. You need to go over there and greet him. And they went over there, and he started, you know, shaking his hand, and they started hugging him, and he starts tearing up again. It was so fitting because he was sitting there like a proud grandfather, and these kids are standing around. It was like his grandchildren. And I realized that those kids could go on to do whatever they wanted to do. And a part of it is because of the doors that man in that wheelchair had opened for them. Those kids are 20 years old. I'd love to know what they're doing now. And of course, I cannot have this discussion without talking about probably the Tuskegee Airman, who has influenced me more than any of the others, who was a part of this teacher symposium until he could not do it anymore. And that is Brigadier General Charles E. McGee. And let me just tell you, he was always teaching the next generation. That was his thing. He had a life of service, and up until 102 years old, and he's still serving people. And he was always gracious. I'm standing there with him and Molette Green, who's News Channel 4 here in Washington, D.C., and we all have something in common, right? And we stood there, but we were on television that morning. It was a Memorial Day weekend, but afterwards we got to sit at his dining table, and he's so gracious. You talk about, he is was the consummate gentleman, and I got to see that. But he passed in January, and his funeral was June 17th. But when he passed, there was a memorial service for him. And I learned even a couple of more things that I wanted to share with you. He was commanding over in the Philippines or so, somewhere in Asia, something during the Vietnam War. And one of his lieutenants was from a very affluent family. And his dad was rich. His dad was going to fly out there and have a birthday party for his son. And but his dad did not like black folk, and he told his son, yeah, I'm having it, but no black folk. He says, well, Dad, my commanding officer is black. And he says, well, tell him he can't come. And the son told his dad, I knew you were going to say that, and so I'm just going to let you know, if he can't come, no one else is coming. And Colonel McGee went on to say that everybody went to the party. Everybody had a good time. But my last story that I've shared with him, that I had just found out, when he was commanding, he had a young lieutenant come to him, was bawling, was like, Colonel, I want to fly. And the flight surgeon said he's not going to sign me off because I've got this inner ear issue or something like that. And Colonel asked him, he says, son, how bad do you want it? He says, Colonel, I don't want, there's nothing I want more than this. He says, follow me. And Colonel takes him out. And they fly, and they do all these maneuvers to test out his being able to stand up to that. And he came back down, and Colonel took him to the flight surgeon and said, I need you to sign him off. The flight surgeon said, no, because if he does this, 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 and this, it's going to kill him. And the Colonel said, well, look. And then Colonel said, well, look, we just did this, 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 and he was just fine. And he signed him off. That young lieutenant went on to become NASA astronaut Frank Borman. Oh my goodness, there is a direct correlation with something that General McGee did for someone, and now and we know him as an astronaut, a NASA astronaut. And so, listen, I mean, so many stories of individuals, and we can't tell them all. But we must answer the question, why is this important? Because listen, everybody needs to hear inspiring stories. Everybody needs to be inspired. Everybody needs to know that, you know, every American has contributed to the country that we have. And to however degree great we are, it is because many individuals were willing to lay their lives down. And you know, yeah, if we're going to get better, we need to be honest about who we've been in the past. That includes our good history and our not so good, our bad history, right? We've got to be honest with it, because whether good or bad, our past can be redemptive if we allow it to change us for the better. And I hope we do that. But here's what I want to say to you teachers. My goodness, the cure for cancer could be sitting in your classroom. An affordable fuel source could be sitting in your classroom. You know, these issues that we're dealing with in our country today, the answer could be sitting in your classroom. And so we cannot, we have to make sure that we are serious about these kids, even the ones who get us upset sometimes because we don't know what's on the inside of them. But I say this to all of you teachers. Let me tell you, you have your pulse on, or should I say, you will influence what this country is going to look like in the next 40 years from now. And I know you can handle it because y'all are educators, and that's what you do. Now, I know a lot of you have questions, and so we are going to answer those questions right now.